production. All right, so when you guys come in to do your soldering setup, you're gonna have to use your template to line up all your pieces, but you don't wanna solder on top of that plastic sheet protector. So you're gonna have to be like a magician and kinda line everything up, hold the pieces down, and carefully slide that template out. If your piece has straight sides, I have these little rails you can put down and you can use the push pins and hold it all together. However, if you're doing a circular shape or like a hot air balloon or a bird or something that doesn't have straight sides, these aren't going to help you at all. So the tricky part is kind of getting started and having everything stay in place. So if you have a bigger design like this, what I would suggest is starting from the middle and working out. That way, if things wiggle around the edges, you can always kind of put them back to place. All right? So your first step, you're going to just line everything up, and then you're going to use the flux. So this flux is special chemical, and the flux just helps the solder flow and kind of move a little bit. It kind of lowers the melting point, so it will help it just kind of settle into those seams. So you're going to want to brush the flux on, and right now I'm just worried about the seams. I'll do the edges after, okay? There's only one container of flux, so whoever's soldering will just have to kind of share it amongst the 3 people. So once it's fluxed, then you're going to pick up the soldering iron. You'll see the tip will look kind of oxidized and kind of grimy. You're going to want to use a wet sponge, and you can use that wet sponge just to burn off all that goo that gets settled on the edge of the tip. So if you're having trouble picking up the solder, see how now it looks nice and shiny? It'll work a little bit better, okay? The hardest part is going to be picking up a chunk of solder with the tip of the soldering iron. This is something that's just going to take a little practice. There's a big learning curve with it. But the biggest tip I can give you, one, make sure you're not trying to pick up the solder over your piece of glass, because it will fall, and if the hot metal hits the glass, it could crack it. So make sure you're over empty space, not over your feet, right? You don't want to drop the solder on your toes. You're only going to touch the very tip of the iron to the very end of the solder. And it just will go on enough to melt. You see how there's a little glob on there? So once I have the little glob attached, I'm just going to tap on the seam. Okay, so I'm going to just kind of go back and forth, pick up a piece, and just tap it on the seams. So the first step is just tacking everything together. So that's what this is. It's called tacking. So I'm just going to go across all those seams, being careful as I do it, not to wiggle my pieces. Okay? And all it takes is a little bit of solder to actually hold them all together. Right? Pretty cool. It's a little floppy. You can see it's wiggly, but it's enough to hold it together. So again, that's where you would want to start tacking from the inside out. You could even just lay out the first couple, tack those, add your other pieces around, tack those. Depending on your design, it might work better, you know. But starting on the inside is usually helpful in case things wiggle. Once you have the seams tacked, then you're going to go and start filling in the rest of the seam to give it a little bit more structure. So again, you're just going to kind of keep picking it up. And again, I'm holding the tip to the tip. Okay, and I can start dragging out the seam to fill it up. Okay, so I'm just kind of melting as I go, just to fill in those gaps, like that. At this point, I am not really worried at all about how neat it looks, because I'm going to have to flip this over and do the same thing on the back. When I fill the seams on the back side, it's going to screw up the front side. All right, so it's kind of like a multi-step process. You're going to tack the front, you're going to fill the front, just get it filled. Then you're going to flip it over to the back, fill the back. No matter how good the front looks, after you fill the back, the front's going to look all messed up again. Then you're going to flip it back over, and then you're going to make prettier seams on the front side. Okay? Oh, and you got to do the edges in there too. Okay? So again, I filled basically all of those seams. Okay? So now, once they're all filled in, I could. I could do the sides kind of whenever. I'm going to add a little bit more flux. Again, it doesn't have to be super precise. Unroll this, careful, it's going to get hot, so just be sensitive when you're touching things. Again, I'm just going to keep picking it up. Oh, and it's getting a little hard to pick up, so I'm going to clean off the tip. Kind of burn off all that oxidation. And now I should be able to pick up a nice glob, and I can do the edges. Your piece is going to heat up, right? There's a lot of metal on this. It's going to conduct heat. So be careful anywhere you touch the glass, because it might, even if you're soldering here, this stuff might get a little warm. If it's hard to handle, I have some pliers, and I also have some metal bookends that you can use to like prop up your piece. But if it's a bigger piece, you should be able to kind of like hold it and do the edges and kind of cover up anywhere it's copper, right? And you can kind of, once there's solder on there, you can kind of slide it around and just use it on the edges just to cover all that copper up, okay? So now I'm gonna flip it over. I'm gonna add a bit more flux, and I'm gonna start filling in from the back. So again, people will try to grab too much solder at a time, and if you hold this not at the tip, what's often going to happen is you're going to just drop the glob. The soldering iron can't pick up a big piece, so if you try to pick up too much, you're just going to break it off and it's going to fall on the board. All right, so try not to do that. Try to hold it right to the tip and just get enough that it will stick to the tip of the soldering iron. All right, once these are globbed on the board, you can just pick it up right from the board too. You might not pick up the whole thing in one go, but see how it's only picking up what it can kind of handle? Yeah, I know, the sizzle, right? So don't waste those little droplings. These are also really handy if you have a bigger gap that's challenging to fill. You can, those are still a little warm, so I'm not going to pick them up, but these are some from before that have cooled. This one's really a big glob. But if I had a bigger hole that I was trying to fill, I could even like put that there and kind of melt the whole thing right into the seam. Yeah, it's on the glass. I want to be careful about not melting the solder on the glass and have it crack. But see how you can kind of use that and melt it right in? It's kind of mesmerizing, isn't it? Mm-hmm. All right, so the back's looking pretty good now, but guess what? When I flip it over, the front's going to be all screwed up. This is why you want to avoid having humongous seams. The smaller the seam, the less it will mess up on front to back. The bigger the seam, the more it's going to kind of puddle and pool and flow out in weird ways. So decide which side you want to be the front. All right, so it really doesn't matter. It might depend on your design or this type of glass that you've chosen. Typically, the front of a stained glass project will have seams that instead of being flat are kind of like bubbled up, like a convex, an outer bubble, okay, of a seam instead of having a flat seam. So you can see these were some I did this morning. These were some I just did that are flat. Do you see the difference? This looks a little bit more finished. So to do that, it's going to require a bit more solder. So you're going to have to add a little bit more material on there. And again, every now and then I'm just adding flux just to help the melting. Okay, so right now I'm just going to throw a bit more solder on there. I'm not being too particular about it. I'm just going to build up that seam, get more solder added. Okay, and again, I'm just kind of throwing it down, and I'll show you how you can make a nice seam. Okay, so once I have enough on there, it doesn't look bad, but it's a little bumpy and irregular. So once the solder's on there, then you can kind of just glaze your iron over that whole seam and kind of try to melt the entire seam and then just let it cool. See how I kind of liquefied the whole thing and it finds its own level and just kind of smooths out really nicely? I probably wouldn't be able to do this entire thing, but I can kind of do it in batches, right? So again, I'll kind of do it over here. I'm just going to add some more material. You can pick up some of these globs. Again, the solder's expensive, so we don't want to waste it. We want to try to use all the bits we can. Okay, so I'm adding the globs, and then I'm just slowly moving my soldering iron across that seam until the whole thing is kind of liquefied and looks even, and then I'm just going to let it do its thing and cool. Okay? Make sense? Great. So again, first step, line everything up, add your flux. Tack the pieces together to hold everything in place. Fill the front. You can do the edges at that point too. Carefully, without burning yourself, flip it over. It's going to be a little wobbly, so you might need to use, you know, a tool to kind of support it as you flip it over. Then you're going to finish the edges and fill the back. All right? Get the back looking as good as you can, but one side's always going to look better. Flip it back over to the front, and then try to bubble up the seams. The edges, you can't add that kind of bubble to, or that dome. Just the inner seams you'll be able to do like that. Okay? Any questions? Okay.